Welcome, everyone. We're going to January 15th, 2013 meeting of the Santa Barbara City Ordinance Committee to order. And we have a presentation today and items for consideration. Nina, would you start us off, please?
Mr. Chair, Beatriz Galarte will be giving a staff presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair House, members of the Council Ordinance Committee. We're here today to discuss and go over one of our key implementation measures of our recent general plan update. We're here to consider the new proposed non-residential growth management program and its components. And it's basically the whole program that will replace what once was Measure E, and which the council, the new next increment of growth that the council recently adopted as part of their general plan. So the idea is to go over some of the key components of the ordinance and the resolution that administers what's set out in the ordinance, and forward all these amendments to council for your introduction and eventual adoption. We want to touch on our presentation a basic overview of the whole growth management program, talk a little about the process that a development plan process is required of projects now. The development plan.
Hold on just for a moment, please. Ms. Johnson, would you go ahead and turn those lights out over there on that side? Is that the one? There we go. That's a little bit better. Thank you.
The development plan findings that are required, and our new traffic management strategy, as well as just touch on the adaptive management program that will oversee all of this. By way of background, as I just briefly mentioned, in December of 2011, you adopted an updated general plan, and your council, as well as the subcommittee, carefully came up with what the next increment of growth should be, and that's policy LG2 in the land use element of the general plan. And it was that we should see 1.35 net new non-residential square footage built over the next 20 years. In order to administer that 1.35 million, we're needing to update the implementing ordinance. That ordinance has historically been known as the Development Plan Ordinance, and it was 28.87.300, and it was part of the whole Measure E that was adopted in '89. Well, the Measure E expired in 2009, and we've undergone some recent extensions on the ordinance, as you know, and that ordinance that we're operating under now is effective until January of next year. Once this new ordinance is adopted, then it would become the operational ordinance. So we have been meeting with the Planning Commission over the past year, and we most recently went in December of last year, where they forwarded their recommendations on this ordinance and resolution, and that is what you have before you in your packet. In looking at the non-residential growth management program, some of the main considerations are those that were some of the goals of our general plan, is this important value of living within our resources. It continues to be at the forefront of our general plan and our growth management program. That we want to prioritize community benefit land uses. That last increment, this increment of growth that we have left for the next 20, that it be the community benefit type uses that we want to see. That we also ensure a strong and diverse economy. That we encourage a mix of land uses and focus growth around transit services. All along, we've put a big emphasis on our program that most of development have a priority to develop downtown. That we utilize what existing transportation capacity is left, that we utilize it efficiently, and that we reserve any constrained transportation capacity for these high priority land uses. Also, that we try and establish or simplify a process as much as possible. The implementation tools, again, are, so if you're an applicant and you're walking in the door and you want to add non-residential square footage to your property, you have to comply with an ordinance, which is what's before you, and that is now going to be called Chapter 2885. Before it was a section of a chapter, now it's its own chapter. Also, the transfer of existing development rights ordinance applies because that deals with transferring non-residential square footage, as well as the resolution. We've always had a resolution that gives you the administrative procedures. That resolution is also being updated. the primary components of the ordinance and the resolution. It covers the allocation categories. Where can I get my square footage from? The definitions, what meets an allocation category type. The process that a project will undergo, depending on the size of your project, the entitlements, and where it's going, you'll have a certain process. The standards for review and findings, what will be required of your project for the granting of the development plan. The proposed traffic management strategy that we'll go into more later in this presentation is how we will assess the traffic impacts on your project. The administrative procedures and the process for community benefit projects. Currently, the way that an applicant can get non-residential square footage is they typically get it from either community benefit, and those are the types of uses that your full council will decide on whether it meets a community benefit or not. A small addition, they can get it from vacant property if they were vacant. As part of the general plan update policy, there was a number of categories that are excluded from the 1.35 million. Or you can get a transfer of existing development rights. We've tried to work within the basic parameters of the existing ordinance because the ordinance has worked well for the past 20 years. Generally, most of the definitions have worked well, but we are making some changes as necessary. And one of the key changes is that right now you can, if you meet one of the, if you're able to get one of these allocations, it could be anywhere in the city. We didn't differentiate whether if you're downtown, you can get a small addition, but if you're in another area, you can't. One of the main changes, as you'll see in the traffic management strategy, is that certain allocation categories will be dependent on where the project is located. Again, we'll go over that. So just in summary, for community benefit, that allocation amount for the next 20 years is 600,000 square feet. And community benefit now is going to be made up of both the community priority and economic development. One change to our process is that's proposed and was supported by the Planning Commission was that currently a project's going to start the process. They go to council to get a preliminary designation by the council. They go to Planning Commission, they get a recommendation on the designation, and then they go back to City Council for a final designation. We're now proposing that it go to the council once early in the process to get designated as a community benefit project, and then that it go on with the process required without the need to return for a final designation. Also, all of this process is set up in the resolution that's included.
Before you go to the next slide, I just have a quick question. So I understand, and we've been, as we watch the process go through, the community priority and economic development are both under community benefit. But it seems like from our report that we're continuing to make a distinction between community priority and economic benefit. So they haven't really been, I mean, clarify for me, please. It appears that they haven't really been merged into just one category. They're actually just under a single heading, but they're actually still two separate categories. Am I?
That's correct.
I'd like to really have you clarify.
That is correct. And primarily the reason we kept them as two separate categories is because community benefit are those types of projects that could possibly get overriding considerations and are your historical traditional community benefits like hospitals and schools and churches, et cetera. The economic development, those are going to be treated differently under the traffic management strategy. So we wanted to keep them with like two separate definitions. But as far as putting them all under the 600,000, it's so that it's not so clearly defined. If you happen to use, for example, if we would have split them 300, you might have a little more community benefit. We didn't want to have to come back and change the ordinance to have to do that. So it's all under one big category of 600,000.
And maybe a little bit more information on the development of this thought. It seemed to me at the time, not to get into discussion, but just maybe you can help a little bit, that part of the intention of putting it all into one was it would be actually one category. And one of the things I realize now, it appears that we're really maybe not distinguishing exactly how many square feet are in each, but they are still distinct. And maybe Ms. Weiss has some more to comment on that.
Yes, at the time that the general plan policy was being considered, we looked at what has been the practice, and we found that there were a few projects that we would do something called a dual designation. And we would call them community priority, but we would take the square footage out of economic development. And it was just the way that the square footage category available was growing in economic development, and it was shrinking in community priority. And so we felt that it made more sense in dividing up the 1.35 million to have one sum that at the council's discretion you could allocate between these different types of projects.
Great, thanks. It's very clear for me. Thank you very much. Please go on.
Again, the basic definition of community priority is staying pretty much the same, that it meets a broad public benefit, it's not principally operated for private profit, and it's necessary to meet a present or projected need directly related to health, safety, or general welfare. Examples of those, there's a list there. Like I said, there's community centers, museums, educational institutions, childcare facilities, etc. Economic development are those projects that enhance the standard of living for City and South Coast residents or strengthen the local and regional economy, create new jobs, or enhance the city's revenue base. Past examples are these. Cottage Hospital got a pretty large economic development. Sansom Clinic, the Granada Theater, and some office buildings. As far as the small additions category, that's one that we see a lot of, and that pot is 400,000 square feet for the next 20 years. It's allocated at 20,000 square feet per year. And this is another change that's being proposed and that Planning Commission was actually recommended. In the past, when any unused or expired square footage rolled over into the economic development category, and now we're proposing that any expired or unused, that at the end of the year when we report to the Planning Commission, that they can decide whether, depending on how much is in the allocation categories and the need, that it could either roll back into small additions for future use or into the community benefit. So that'll be decided annually. Won't automatically roll over to what would now be the community benefit. It's still 2,000 square foot per lot.
We have a
If I may,
question here.
so you're just trying to be responsive to what the market is doing?
Yes, exactly. The small addition category is really the tool for existing businesses, existing commercially improved property to make small additions and improvements. And we've had slow years and we've had boom years. And to go to the economic development category, that's really been reserved as much more of a discretionary decision. You know, it's a decision by the council to allocate. So we want to keep the idea that the Planning Commission had, that keeping the 400,000 within small addition, continue to have it for that purpose, to help the local economy respond to the booms, that made sense to keep it there. Now, in the event that we see the community benefit allocation potential draining down, and for some reason there's not much use of the small addition, it could be that we think, well, let's move this remaining 10,000 this year and put it into the community benefit pot. I think that is less likely. I think basically that the 400,000 will probably remain, in the small addition, but the idea that the Planning Commission we came up with was make that determination on an annual basis about where the square footage should
And
go.
the Planning Commission does it.
That's the recommendation, yes.
Thank you.
And Ms. Weiss, were there any findings that would go along with making that decision? In other words, was there guidance as to what would be the criteria for keeping it in small additions or putting it into economic development? Or is that just truly just a discretionary moment?
I'd have to find it in the ordinance, Mr. Vincent. I don't remember if we really qualified why.
A resolution.
It's in the resolution that would be the procedure, but I'm not sure that we gave guidance. That could be a good idea. Just based on community needs for economic improvement on small scale versus larger scale, I suppose.
Mr. Vincent?
Chair House, if you could ask the question again. I'm sorry, I was following.
The question is, and maybe we just want to footnote this for later, but it might be something we want to look at, and that is, what would the findings be for keeping the small additions in small additions or transferring them to, was it community benefit? Yeah, community benefit. So have findings been established that would be used for making that kind of decision? Is there any guidance for how that decision would be made by the Planning Commission?
Thank you. Really, there are no findings at this time proposed for guiding the Planning Commission. I think it would really, we left it open initially because I think the Planning Commission is going to be on the ground, seeing which projects are coming through. It may, the allocation may even change, or their decision on which way the square footage should go may vary from year to year. We anticipated that kind of variance where economic development may be needing more square footage at some point or keeping it in small addition. I think that we didn't have a particular set of findings. We were going to leave it to the discretion and the experience of the Planning Commission based on what they were seeing, what kinds of projects they were seeing coming through. So if the committee has suggestions on findings, maybe we do have a couple of our planning commissioners here. Maybe they have thoughts on that as well as to what kind of information they would be, what would be useful.
Okay, that might be something we want to
that.
discuss. Mr. Rouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Ms. Weiss, then you say in sum that this is this proposed ordinance has more latitude than the current set of conditions for approval?
Yes.
More discretion?
Currently, the procedure is written that at the end of any year, if there's remaining square footage in the small addition, it automatically went to economic development. That is how the economic development category was initially created, which is one of the reasons why it's that way now, and it really doesn't need to be that way in the future. I'm not sure if you need the whole story, but 3 million square feet was Measure E, and that was 1989. In 1995, 6 years later, there was a charter amendment to create the economic development category. And what the community decided was we were not increasing the 3 million. That was going to remain constant. The economic development category was created by the unused square footage of the prior years and would continue to be sustained with unused square footage. Okay, so that was then. Now was in December of 2011 when you adopted the general plan, you set out that category from the start. So in our view, we didn't really see the need to keep replenishing that category. Rather, the commission saw the need to retain this 400,000 for all the properties that might want to improve over time in response to the economy and their needs to improve their properties. And so that's why I said I don't really see that it's very likely that we would be giving that, the Planning Commission would be wanting to give that to economic development. But who knows? We can't predict what will happen each year, as this unfolds. But that's my hunch. And I thought it was a really good call on their part to say, 400,000 for the whole community to be able to add these small additions, that's not that much. And they wanted to retain it for those property owners and businesses. That's how I understood it.
Very good. I just made a little note. We might want to come back in terms of what might be guidance criteria for doing that. Yes, please, Ms. Galarte.
And that would be 2,000 square foot per lot, and that would be cumulative since 1989. We're carrying that forward. So if someone already got a small addition, they wouldn't be entitled to another one. As far as summary of vacant properties, that was based on a survey that was done in 1988, and that allocation category has about 350,000 for the next 20 years. There remains, from Measure E, which it was much larger, there remains about 357,000 that didn't get allocated, so we think the 350,000 is a reasonable number, assuming all vacant property built out. And we're carrying forward, just as it is now, that it's 0.25 floor area ratio per vacant lot since 1988. And that vacant property could be in combination with other allocations, like small additions, minor additions. As far as, so those were the categories for dividing up the 1.35 million, but there's also a number of categories how someone can add that's excluded from that 1.35 net new square footage in the city. And that's, as you recall, city government buildings were going to be excluded from floor area. Currently, city government buildings generally get their square footage from community priority. Now they'll just be excluded. Government displacement projects, we've only seen one or two in the past, probably in the very early 90s. Hotel room for room replacements, minor additions, that's 1,000 square feet or less, and the pending and approved projects. We're calling them prior pending, prior approved, to differentiate that they are, they got their allocation categories from Measure E, but they're still active today. Or a transfer of existing development rights, because that's existing square footage that's being transferred to another site. As far as those prior pending and prior approved projects that are currently in the planning process, and that means they got their square footage already under the current ordinance that's going to be replaced. There is a very small amount of pending. There's about 73,000 square feet of pending projects, and approved about 141,000 for a total of 215,000. And this number keeps changing as projects expire or get approved and built. And they'll continue to change until this ordinance is actually adopted. We've had...
Can we just say, those prior approved could also lapse, could they not, if they're not acted on?
Yes, they could
6 months or a
expire.
year or whatever it is?
Yes, they would expire and that square footage would go
So
away.
that number may go down, is what we're saying.
Correct.
Okay.
All development plan approvals are valid for 4 years, but some of that square footage might not be a development plan. It might be a smaller amount with only design review, and that generally expires, I think it's 2 years. So, yes, that's true. It could happen.
As far as the transfer of existing development rights, we do have an ordinance in our municipal code that deals with transferring existing development rights. At this point, it's not a comprehensive revision that we were proposing to that ordinance. As you might recall, some councils were interested in seeing what we should do with demolished square footage and that maybe it shouldn't carry forward. But that's not what we're proposing as part of this work program. It's basically any changes that are related to be consistent with the traffic management strategy. And also for this, this new transfer, small transfer that we're proposing be allowed throughout the city, a one-time transfer of 1,000 square feet or less without the need for a development plan. That also is a change in the ordinance. Currently, if you transfer even 1 square footage, you have to go through the whole development plan process. And because there's a number of projects in the city that have already gotten their minor and small addition, we feel that a one-time transfer, if they can obtain it somewhere, is a good thing for their business.
And that could be transfer anywhere in the city, not just in a particular zone? Or...
Well, no, the 1,000 transfer would still be subject to within their zone. So from the outside areas to the downtown or within their own zone only. Yeah. So as far as the process, the development plan process, I want to go over just some of the changes. Currently, any addition of greater than 1,000 square feet needs a development plan. And that means any addition since 1989. So what that means is, under today's rules, someone could have added 900 square feet as a minor addition, and then they need to add 300 square feet 5 years later. That, because now 1,000 square feet or greater requires a development plan, that, whatever, 400 square foot addition would require a development plan. We're proposing that while the allocation categories to a parcel stay the same, you still get a minor, you still get a small, that the need for a development plan is based on the project before the decision maker. So if it's 1,000 square feet or less at that point in time, they don't need a development plan. And that'll eliminate this extra development plan process for those projects that are really small in size. Oh, and in addition, that 1,000 square foot or less transfer of existing developments, we're also proposing that it not require a development plan. And Planning Commission was supportive of all of these changes. The process right now is we're basically keeping the process as it is now as far as development plans before the design review boards or the staff hearing officer. For projects that are 1,000 to 3,000 square feet, if it strictly design review, it would stay at the design review level. If it needs other entitlements like modifications, a tentative subdivision map of 5 units or less, then it would stay at the staff hearing officer level. There are a couple of changes in the Planning Commission review level. They'll still see the 1 to 3,000 with other entitlements that the Planning Commission normally reviews. That's no change. If it's greater than 1,000 square feet, the Planning Commission will review those. Any project with an EIR, they'll review those. That's, again, no change. The one change is that the TEDRs of greater than 1,000, those are the only TEDRs they would see. If it's 1,000 square feet or less, it wouldn't need to go to Planning Commission because it wouldn't require a development plan. Also, the other change is that no need for the Planning Commission to recommend on the community benefit designation to council. Before, if something was at the design review level, they would need to get a recommendation by the Planning Commission, and now that won't be necessary.
Before you move on, then, noticing, however, for each of these, even the smaller ones, how would that be handled? The idea, of course, is if it goes to Planning Commission, there's broader noticing. But what about for the smallest of these kinds of projects? Neighbors will still be noticed, there'll still be a yellow sign, that kind of thing, so people who would have an interest could comment or participate?
Yes, the noticing will remain the same. Development plans will be noticed at either board.
Yes, the noticing is the same. It's 300 feet radius, and the findings are the same. So the Architectural Board or Historic Landmarks Commission and Staff Hearing Officer, they make the same set of findings as the Planning Commission does as well.
Okay, so no development plan requirement doesn't mean that below that there's no noticing. The noticing would be just as it's been
Well,
for smaller projects?
If an addition is proposed on a small shopping center in the outer State Street or downtown, wherever, and it's before the Architectural Board of Review, we review the municipal code for the ABR to determine if the project needs a notice or not. So again, it's not a development plan, it's an ABR project. And I think the ABR noticing requirement, I'm remembering 500 square feet or something as possibly the trigger for when noticing is required.
So
It's no change from the way it is today.
That's my question. So a commercially zoned property that's adjacent to a residential zone, like along Milpas or something,
Mm-hmm.
the neighbors would be noticed if there's a development, even if it's not a development plan, if there's some
Per the
improvements.
current ABR
Per the current
ordinance.
ABR ordinance. All right, thank you.
On the part about not having Planning Commission comment on community benefit, we wanted to tell you that we had never saw a project that the council, after they did the initial, declined to follow through, and we just really felt that that was an unnecessary extra step, that when the council decides that this allocation is appropriately initiated, by allocating, if the project turns out to be controversial and needs to come before council through an appeal process, it will. But the question about whether or not it really should have that initial allocation, that never really changed, and so we were simplifying the process on that.
Okay, thank you.
The findings are basically that it complies with the zoning ordinance, that it's consistent with the principles of sound community planning, so with the general plan or, for example, the local coastal program if in the coastal zone, that it's compatible with the community and neighborhood aesthetics or character, and again, we're going to use the project compatibility analysis that is done for all ABR and HLC projects when it's required, and that it's consistent with the traffic management strategy. So as far as consistent with the new traffic management strategy, we're going to try and summarize that new component of this program. We've had a couple of focus group meetings with 2 focus groups, and also 2 meetings with the Planning Commission on the initial approach. The traffic component is included in both the ordinance and the resolution. As part of the general plan update, the final EIR evaluated all of the traffic associated with this potential build-out that could happen over the 20 years. And what we found as a result of the EIR was that any additional traffic is going to result in cumulative traffic impacts. So that finding that we've always made historically, that there's no significant traffic impacts, could no longer be made. So the council, in deliberating and adopting the general plan, made overriding considerations for those cumulative traffic impacts. The new traffic strategy is based on findings in the final EIR, and that was that most projected growth would be distributed to the downtown. When the distributions were done, a majority of it was sent to the downtown. It identified different traffic generation rates by location within the city, and it found that we should focus square footage where traffic mitigation measures can be most effective. Some of the key components, it's that it's going to allow certain development categories depending on the location in the city. It's going to limit TEDRs also by location in the city. It identifies which development categories are eligible for overriding considerations for those project-specific traffic impacts, and the cumulative traffic impacts will no longer be a project stopper. Currently, one of the reasons we have to say no to so many projects is because of the cumulative traffic impact. And those have been overridden by the City Council. As far as the locations in the city, the map here shows the 6 different development areas, with the downtown being the largest. It includes the waterfront area and goes pretty much up to Constance. We have the Coast Village Road area, the Riviera, Upper State, the Mesa, and the airport. So we're going to just summarize the different areas. In the downtown area, we're proposing that all non-residential allocation categories be allowed, and that the following categories of development could not get overriding project-specific impacts. Any prior pending, and that's the case now, pending projects could not get overriding. Small additions, economic development, or TEDRs greater than 1,000 square feet. Any transfer of existing developments in the downtown would be allowed from within the downtown or coming in from any of the outlying areas.
But not going the other way.
Not going the other way, correct. As far as the outlying development areas, that all non-residential allocation categories are proposed to be allowed, with the exception of small additions and economic development projects. Also, that you could not override project-specific for prior pending or TEDRs greater than 1,000 square feet. Here, TEDRs would only be allowed within the same development area. They could not get TEDRs from downtown or any other area. The airport, it's kind of its own entity. We're proposing there that that they be able to get allocation categories from all the various categories. And in the airport case, we do traffic analysis. We coordinate it with the county, City of Goleta, and Caltrans. And that we would continue to review projects on a case-by-case basis in consultation with these entities. All of this program will be regulated or reviewed under the adaptive management program. Currently, we track square footage very carefully, the demolished square footage, new square footage, housing units, et cetera, and we give a biannual report to the Planning Commission. We're proposing that we will continue to track all the demolitions, all the new additions, the transfer of existing development rights, and we'd give yearly reports to the Planning Commission as part of this adaptive management program. And these reports are going to be very important because it's going to be the way that we can adjust policy as needed or adjust allocation allowances, for example, the small addition and the economic development, as we see development happening over the years. When we went to the Planning Commission in December, we did receive 2 public comment letters, and those were addressed as part of that review. We received one letter from Ralph Horowitz with the Horowitz Group. He owns the property at 350 South Hitchcock, which is, I believe, the Lexus dealership property. And he was requesting that economic development be allowed in the PD zone in the outer State Street, because it would be very difficult for them to get square footage otherwise, and it's a pretty large property. He was also requesting that the city consider allowing overriding considerations for economic development. We also received a letter at the time, and we've received it also as part of this hearing, from the Santa Barbara Growth Management Program Stakeholders Group, requesting that we expand the program to allow small additions and economic development in the outlying areas, and that we also consider allowing overriding considerations for economic development and TDR projects downtown. As far as the review at Planning Commission, the Planning Commission did support making an amendment and incorporating into the ordinance, allowing a new category under community benefit that allows square footage for specifically out-of-sales projects in the PD zone. The PD zone is very defined. It's pretty much those properties off of Hitchcock. And so that got incorporated into the ordinance. They did not recommend any other changes as a result of the public comment. And after my presentation, Mr. Dayton will follow up also on the letter that we received today. As far as the next steps,
Mr. Rouse has a question, please, Ms. Galarte.
Actually, my question was going to be for Mr. Dayton, so maybe I should wait.
Okay, hold on tight. He'll be coming.
as far as what's next, we're hoping to hear from you today on any changes proposed to the ordinance or resolution. And then depending on your input today and how far we get on that, the idea is to go for council introduction in February, early February. We're tentatively scheduled for February 5th with adoption the following week. If we keep those timelines, or any time when it's adopted, the ordinance would become operational 30 days from adoption. So any new projects coming in from that day forward would be subject to the new regulations. That ends my presentation. Thank you.
And before Mr. Dayton starts, I'm hoping that somewhere and soon you would, one of you would identify what the rationale was or had been discussed for the not allowing overriding considerations for economic development and TEDR projects downtown, given the general direction of the traffic management program. Mr. Rouse may have a question to help frame your remarks.
Yes, because it involves first of all, the nuance between traffic demand strategy and traffic demand management, which is the terms we've heard a lot of in the general plan update. And I'd like you to maybe expand on that for me, if you would. And then in addition to that, we talked about the modeling in the CAR and this Exhibit B. They talked about how in some of the outlying areas that there they are. There. The base of observations of actual traffic behavior, the modeling had different generation rates out in the outlying area. So if you could tie that in for me, I think it goes with the chair's question as well.
Okay, good. Mr. Dayton.
Great. Mr. Chair and council members, we just really want to be careful to address the letter that you received from Scott Schell and that also went to the Planning Commission. The people in the signature block represent the rock stars of planning, if you will. I mean, they're the people that we work with the most. We really highly respect them. In fact, they signed their letter from the stakeholders committee, and actually we formed that stakeholders group because we wanted to invite them to help do the heavy lifting. Is this the right approach? Are we on the right track? They're the people who run the process, run the system. They're the most familiar with. They don't need education on the vocabulary. And so they came alongside us and gave us their time, and it was very valuable. I will say that this group, many of the things, the suggestions that they have were very helpful in shaping what you're seeing today. They were very, very helpful. We had, for instance, one of the recommendations they had is they wanted to be able to, in talking about shifting square footage, make sure that it could come from the outlying area to the downtown. That was incorporated. Other suggestions were incorporated. I think when you see in this letter, the main theme of this letter that is outlined, there's three things that they're recommending we go above and beyond what we came to. So in framing your question, Councilmember Rouse, really the basis, in the past 20 years, we said no all the time to development because it was very easy to get to a traffic impact. In other words, add traffic to an already impacted intersection. That was very easy to do, and very few projects could go over that hurdle. In the thing that you're looking at now, the proposal you're looking at now, that barrier is now gone for the majority of the city. So in other words, where the hands of development were tied the past 20 years, we have now broken those bonds for a majority of the city. And when I say the majority of the city, the outlying areas, we are keeping those bonds on, so to speak. Why is that? Well, when you gave us the direction to override these traffic impacts, you also said make sure that you reduce congestion over the next 20 years. It's a balancing act that we're up against. So the outline areas, the way the model distinguished the traffic patterns of the outline areas and the downtown. In the downtown, we can put a square footage, we can put square feet of commercial, and it will have much less traffic impact than if you put that square footage in an outline area. In other words, it generates less traffic. So from the get-go, if we're focusing traffic in the downtown and the core, the central core, it's going to have less of an impact. And then also, the other thing that the council is confronted with is, in the downtown core, not only do we have the room, we also have the flexibility in the future to apply traffic mitigation measures that will be highly successful. We have, at the flip of a switch, we can do measures that will be effective right now, not over time. And the biggest one is the controversial one, is the parking pricing, not ripe yet for today. But if the council wanted to in the future, they could employ that, and we could actually change the traffic flow in downtown immediately. In the outlying areas, we don't have those options. We don't have that option. The council's not going to have that option. We're going to be outlining some minor tweaking to squeeze every ounce of traffic capacity that we can in those areas, but you're very limited. So what you develop from here on out in those areas is going to be the traffic congestion that you're going to live with for, until transportation changes fundamentally as we know it. That could happen. So what we did in this balancing act is we said, okay, focus downtown, and then in the outline areas, keep the restraints on, but then also apply a flexibility that we didn't have in the last 20 years, and that's this transferring within the area. We think that that's the thing that will give the property owners and the people who really, really want to do something in the outer areas the flexibility to do that, particularly partnering with other sites, so that you can pull square footage from one building and then move it perhaps a couple blocks down the street to another development site, say in coordination with developing housing. Because housing, we're saying you can have a traffic impact. We can override those. We want housing. That's part of your principles of planning for the next 20 years is we want more housing citywide. So we left that unrestrained. So you could develop housing on one site and then move your commercial down to another and combine it and get the project you want, the size project you want in an outline area. So we believe that flexibility is there. What the group asked us to do is really take off the binds throughout the city. And that's just what we weren't prepared to propose. We believe, based on the direction you've given us, that we are trying to get as much economic development as we can, the incremental that you want to propose, the square footage that you've suggested, the amount that you've suggested, and do it in a way that will create the least amount of traffic impacts. On Upper State Street now, even now, not even talking about the future, just today, we have people who are very concerned, citizens who are very concerned about the traffic that's up there, even today, not even talking about the additions that we're allowing and permitting. So that's where we landed on the whole in balance. You saw some restraints also in the downtown now for the new level, not cumulative traffic impact, but project-specific impact. It's a new level. It's a new bar. It's a new level of restraint. And I believe that level of restraint is much higher. In other words, it will be much harder to have a development that will be big enough to trip and to make project-specific impact a hurdle. So we are, in fact, it is my belief that traffic impacts is no longer going to be the big issue that you hear about with these new guidelines. We're going to have the capacity, if you will, in the process for allowing those buildings to move forward. It'll be very hard, even for an economic development project, particularly if they're transferring within the downtown, to reach the level of project-specific impact. So I don't believe that that'll be a hurdle. All that said, one thing we didn't have the last 20 years was we have an adaptive management program. Intentionally, we want to come back to the council to avoid what happened in the last 20 years, which was unintended consequences of our program, and revisit. How's it going? What are the number of projects that are getting through the process? Are there projects, economic development projects, that cannot happen because of the constraints? or what is happening, what is getting constrained, and report those back. And then we will have a chance to adjust the compass, if you will, at those times. So I hope that answers your question. Again, we're very thankful for the stakeholders group and what they meant to the process. And at the end of the day, we agree on most things. I think that they're very pleased, as they say in their letter, with where we're ending up. But we weren't willing to recommend going any further than we did.
Mr. Dayton, there'll be a question here from Mr. Hotchkiss. But, there was one other point. I was asking about the rationale for not allowing overriding considerations for economic development and TEDR projects downtown. And then the second question has to do with where is the consideration for a project that might be in an outlying area that by its design actually made things better traffic-wise, even though it used more square footage? Where's the chance for that kind of project to come forward?
Okay, let me get to the first question, and then I'm going to try to understand the second one. So what we're doing, what we're saying is we have a limited amount of development that we're going to do over the next 20 years. You've given us the parameters for that in square foot numbers. So, and then you've said now there's a particular amount of traffic impact that's going to be incurred, and that's okay. If someone, as I said, it's going to be very hard to get to that bar of project-specific impact, but let's say someone does get to that level. That would be an indication to you in us is they're taking a very big portion of the incremental amount over time. In other words, they might be taking a little bit too big a portion of pie. And if you're going to allow someone to actually get to that level, we believe that that's an indication that they're going to be taking from other folks, you know, that are moving ahead more incrementally, if that makes sense. In other words, so that would be a pretty big development, and that would kind of be an eyebrow raiser, and that's why we're saying we had the ceiling down here. We said no to overriding considerations at cumulative. Now we're saying yes. And the new no is going to be at this much bigger level of project-specific impact. And we just think that that's an appropriate ceiling for that.
Okay, thanks for that. And then what about the second question?
Tell me,
the idea of overriding considerations is a chance for the decision makers to review a proposal that says that it's consistent with the general or the actual policies, like the traffic management program, even though it may require or would like to have more square footage, like from maybe transfer of development rights from outside the area or from economic development or something like that in an outlying area. If they could make that case, where's the venue for that? Is there a possibility for that?
I understand your question, and it comes down to the definition of a significant impact under CEQA. Oh. To have a significant impact, you must have an adverse impact. We're not talking about cumulative impacts. Those have already been overridden. We're talking about project-specific impacts. This is what Rob was just mentioning. If a project, regardless of its size, improves the condition, the traffic condition, it cannot, by definition, have a project-specific significant traffic impact.
Got it. Then it wouldn't require overriding considerations?
It would not require overriding considerations.
Oh, I see. Now, would it be, in a case like that, is it possible that it would be able to draw from the allocation from economic development, or would TEDRs be available for it from? I'm just curious, because the foundation, of course, I don't even know if it's possible, but the foundation of the principle is that development in the outlying areas is going to have impacts that we can't really remedy well. That's the basic concept, and we're trying to shift the development downtown. Is there a possibility at all, then, I think I'm getting part of an answer, for a project to be proposed that would maintain the status quo or make things better?
It would be pretty hard to add square footage and have an actual reduction in trips. That is exactly what people do today, right? They take an existing, under today's rule where you can't have a cumulative impact, what they'll do is they'll take 10,000 square foot of retail down to 2,000 and then build housing. And so you're getting more, ultimately a bigger building. With
that's
less
actually
of an
kind of
impact.
encouraged in a way from what you're talking about.
And that would continue if people wanted to take that approach. I think another trouble you get is we like buildings to be able to change over time with the economy. In other words, one use of a building may be great for now, and then 20 years from now it's a different use. And generally we allow people to, their traffic demand for any one building is going to change with the use, and that flexibility is important for the economy. So if we get into this case where, well, we're increasing the building size, but then we want to limit the use to of that building only to this fine use that produces less traffic, I think that would present other challenges for us.
So maybe one of the things that you allude to in the staff report has to do with a specific plan approach for, like, I'm thinking really clear. Part of what I'm thinking is 5 points, which is developed in an old design that probably could handle a lot more actual square footage and be much more efficient in terms of its modes of transportation that access it and everything. La Cumbre Plaza, but even there may be other kinds of uses that would come along in our future that would be keeping the kinds of uses in the neighborhood as opposed to requiring more traffic from outlying areas. I mean, I guess maybe your uses argument sort of goes there. But what about the two biggies, the big players, La Cumbre Plaza and 5 Points, or the strip mall kind of situation, which are really auto-oriented in their design?
So for La Cumbre Plaza and 5 Points, we envision exactly what you're talking about, and it's a big unknown. It's what will, in fact, the zoning that we've changed makes it a higher density for residential as well. So we're anticipating what you're saying is that hopefully at some point we get a La Cumbre Plaza that turns into something other than it is, more of a village, more of a downtown center that feels more like the downtown. And in that case, we would do a specific plan. And in a specific plan, it would be outside of all the boundaries that you have here, and it would be handled specifically, and we'd have a lot more flexibility to approve something in a specific plan. Does that make sense? So you would have that flexibility as a council.
Seas of parking and the way that they're designed right now, you could imagine that could be used a lot more efficiently.
That's correct.
Actually, could be better, really, and a lot of reasons, especially for outer State Street or Upper State. All right, great, thanks. That helps me a little bit. And let's see, we have people that have speaker slips. Is there more to the report from staff? Oh, Mr. Hotchkiss, thank you.
You may have just answered it. The project-specific considerations you're talking about, are those the ones you just mentioned as an example, La Cumbre or 5 Points or whatever? So you just look right at specifically there, not worry about cumulative effect or anything else, but just what is that project going to do? And this new ordinance would allow you to do that, whereas you couldn't before?
Only for those areas, only for La Cumbre Plaza, and I think it includes also Ms. Wee's 5 Points. It does include 5 Points as well. So, and again, it's just because at this point we don't know. We can envision in our planning process that area will hopefully sooner than later be ripe for a wholesale redevelopment that looks and feels and lives differently and acts differently. And so instead of trying to develop rules that guide that process, we're just saying it's right for a project-specific plan, and it will require rules that apply to the area within the boundary of this specific plan.
And one of the reasons we sort of have different rules of the game, or what you're proposing for Upper State and downtown, is that Upper State really only has a single street that serves everything.
That's correct, and it's extremely limited in its capacity to move cars. And the downtown is to some extent too, and that limitation, as you know, is at the freeway interchanges. But every square foot you put downtown is going to generate, versus an outer area, is going to generate less traffic, and then we'll have the future flexibility of mitigation measures to alleviate that traffic should the citizens and the council decide, hey, we've got to do something about how much congestion we have.
And you say that with great confidence. Is it from a model, a computer? We're saying that with confidence?
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay.
And then, Mr. Dayton, you've said about the model, and at least in the staff report, and you've talked to us about how we're using this new model for traffic impacts. And I believe the staff report talked about using real-time data to true it up on an ongoing basis. Would you describe what you have in mind with that?
Well, the approach, the approach is in doing all this. Over the last 20 years, we know the headaches of the process, the expense, doing an environmental impact report, extremely expensive. Traffic studies, extremely expensive, time consuming. And so doing this process, we'll look for ways to streamline the process, make it less expensive for the developer, create more certainty in what you're going to get, less unknowns at the decision maker point. And so the model in doing that will give us that flexibility. We'll be using the model primarily to determine whether or not a project rises to the level of project-specific impact. That will be our primary use of that tool. And then we're going to have to come back to you with a proposal of how we charge for that cost, where we place the model. Is it a consultant? Is it in-house? And we're going to do it in the way that is the least expensive and costly for the development community. And we believe it's going to be a fraction of the cost that they spend now. And now that we have the overriding considerations for the cumulative impact in EIR, we're eliminating an EIR for most projects and using the program EIR that we spent so much money on to be used again and again and again and again to recapture those costs.
All right, great. Thank you, Mr. Is there anything else from staff right now? Okay, well, let's see. We have three planning commissioners here today. I want to thank you very much for coming. Deborah Schwartz, June Peugeot, and John Campanella. Is there anything that you'd like to share with us right now before we go to our three speakers from the public? Yes, Mr. Campanella.
Thank you, Chair House. Good afternoon. Yeah, it's a complicated package, I think would be a comment. And I'm amazed how quickly you're all up to speed on it. It took me a while. I don't have a lot of the history background. But I think the approach that I looked at and the Commission looked at was the fact that this was a package. And the package was really, the most significant thing is the fact that cumulative impacts would not have to be addressed and block every project that would come in. If we want economic development in a broad sense, which means, to me, better paying jobs. If we want to convert or add more square footage where the salaries that are needed to afford housing, the new high-tech jobs, green jobs, et cetera, that are coming in, we have the capability to do that. And I had a number of questions during the process up until about 11 o'clock last night, as far as how some of this would work. And the background that staff is giving, I've got 10 new things that came up that I didn't consider on background. We were talking before the meeting that perhaps what the final document looks like in the appendices, that perhaps it'd be clear that, if it's not already, it'd be clear why the reasoning was used for particular aspects of the non-growth ordinance. And I think it would be helpful for the public to understand. And secondly, since we are looking at an adaptive management program, I think it's good to build up a little history when we come back again and say we'd like to make some modifications for, let's say, economic development downtown, project-specific override. We sort of have a history on how we got to this point in the first place, and then we can say, well, the situation has changed, and we can specifically point it out. And I'm not talking the next 2 years. I'm talking 5 or 10 years down the road. I think some of the comments have been made relative to the expenses that would be saved for a cumulative impact. We were talking before the meeting that perhaps just an initial review, an applicant can find out whether the square footage and the layers of square footage that he would be allowed to get on the site would require what extent a traffic report would be needed on a project-specific basis. And hopefully that could be, reduce the amount of work that would have to be done, get a quicker answer as well. I think everything's, I think is pretty positive as I went through, and one of my concerns at the beginning was that we weren't creating buckets that weren't going to be filled, that the $1,350,000 went to certain categories and you couldn't get it out of there. Let's say you had to wait where it might be needed somewhere else. I'm satisfied that that's not going to happen. And I guess procedurally, and I asked this question yesterday, is to make sure that, let's say if we do want to make changes down the road and adaptive, that it's a process of proving why we want to, but this is an ordinance, and hopefully with proper substantiation, the modifications could be made on a pretty timely basis to fit the needs. Because as you know, the economy goes up and down, and when people can get financing, and we need good job growth, on a limited basis under the $1,350,000. It would be nice to be able to make and facilitate those changes on an ongoing basis as we get substantiation from staff. So
Okay, great.
those are my comments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any of the other commissioners? No? All right, thank you very much. Let's go to public comment then. I have 3 speaker slips, Lisa Plowman, then Scott Schell, and then Trish Allen, please.
Mr. Chair, we'd like Scott to start first, and
That's
then
fine.
we'll follow him.
Come on up, Scott. And thank you very much for your letter.
Mr. Chair, council members, my name is Scott Schell. I'm with Associated Transportation Engineers, and I was part of the stakeholders group that Rob had talked about, Mr. Dayton had talked about. We had support most of staff's proposed modifications. As Rob had pointed out, there are a few areas where we're asking for some changes. Ms. Plowman has actually put some suggested language into the ordinance and is being handed out. I think it's in
Great, thank
sort
you.
of a red underline. So the 3 basic areas that we wrote about were the downtown area, and we had asked that you consider still allowing overriding consideration for project-specific impacts for 2 categories, the economic development projects and the TEDRs. For the outlying areas, there were 2 requests. One was to continue to allow the small additions, and that's the 2,000 square feet allocations per parcel. As you probably intoned, those aren't allowed now in this ordinance. So any parcel in those outlying areas forever on can only get a 1,000 square foot allocation. The second was to continue in those areas to allow the council to designate economic development square footage. Those areas include Outer State Street, the Mesa, Coast Village Road, and Hidden Valley. Why, you may ask, why are we asking for these things? Well, for the downtown area, just to continue on Mr. House's discussion, you know, I was thinking, well, we have this goal of moving square footage from Upper State Street to downtown. Well, it's very easy to consider an option where we take that square footage from Outer State Street and move it to a downtown site, say 10,000 square feet. If that site is near an impacted intersection, it would likely have a project-specific impact. So, you know, Mr. Dayton is somewhat confident that even the larger projects that might be considered wouldn't have these impacts, but I'm here to say that it's just as likely that they could. The measurement of a project-specific impact is really going to be 16 cars added to an intersection during the peak hour. So if you added 16 left turns to the freeway at Carrillo because you moved some square footage downtown, you would have a project-specific impact at that point, and the project would not come before you. So I think that there should be some flexibility to allow the movement of the square footage, and that there still be this overriding consideration for those types of development. Same with the economic development allocation. The council deems fit to put that square footage out, but there's some rules in effect that say, no, we can't do that because you have a traffic impact because you happen to be next to an intersection that is currently not operating poorly. So. Operating poorly, not acceptably. So there can be some instances based on location that create still a roadblock to accomplishing the goals of the plan. As for the outlying areas, we've always felt that the small additions really wouldn't undermine staff's management plan, that allowing those parcels to take the 1,000 square feet and then maybe add 2,000 more wasn't going to accelerate the congestion or increase the congestion greater than what was envisioned in the build-out of the general plan and the EIR. So the build-out assumed a certain amount of development in those outlying areas to get to the impacts, and we feel that the minor or the small additions on top of the minor is not going to change that. So we think that that's a reasonable approach. Just for clarification, I looked at the EIR today before I came down, and the tally for downtown impacts where we had 8 existing intersections that were bad, and it was going to go up to 11 in the future. So that's the downtown zones. And the outlying zones, as we defined, there are currently 5 intersections that were bad, including Upper State Street, and it was going to go to 11. So within that framework, I think that there's still some flexibility to allow some growth within the outlying areas and not exceed the congestion that was envisioned by council and overridden.
Okay, very good. Is there anything else?
I have just one other point. There was the economic development projects, same kind of idea. We think that those should be allowed in the outlying areas and was contemplated within the general plan. We have to remember that the ordinance, as currently written, still has checks on those. You still can't have a project-specific impact in the outlying areas. So it's not as if we're going to have rampant growth, we still have this check. If you have a project-specific, it's still a no. It's just allowing a little more flexibility. The last point, I had talked to Mr. Dayton about this before we came down. There was some language within the ordinance on page 25 of attachment 1 that spoke to how this was going to be analyzed in terms of the TEDRs. And the language was fairly limiting as you read it sort of verbatim. And I think it goes against what staff's envisioning of allowing the transfer of square footage within zone to zone and having the trip sort of track within that. The specific language on that page, if you were an attorney, you'd read it and say, well, that's not allowed. This is on page 25 of attachment 1 within the ordinance. So we had suggested to staff that they come up with some language that tied that specific stipulation to the actual mechanics of the traffic management strategy that's back in Appendix B or Exhibit B of the report that talks about using the model to understand how traffic changes within the zone when you move
We'll
forward.
ask Mr. Dayton and the staff to respond to that after
Thank
public
you.
comment then. Thank you, sir. Lisa Plummer? Oh, we have a question for you.
Shell,
Mr.
if I could. Do you in general agree with the description that Mr. Dayton made about how traffic should be handled in the city downtown as opposed to the outlying areas?
Yes, I think that the rationale is sound, that there's certainly less congestion-making attributes downtown than the outlying areas.
And that this ordinance is somewhat less restrictive than the previous Measure E?
It is. I'm going to have less work to do.
All right. And so it's really a matter of refinement then, because you both had the same, we all had the same objective. And so far as traffic is concerned, it's just a matter of which will really work best, correct?
Yeah, and it's fairly small refinement in our eyes, but that's exactly right.
Okay. So will you reply to those afterwards then? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Shell. Lisa Plowman will be followed by Trish Allen.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the Ordinance Committee. I just want to reiterate exactly what Scott was saying, that we're really happy to work with the staff on this and participate in the stakeholder process. And really, overall, we think that the proposal that you have before you today is very good and does make a lot of the needed changes that we've run into over the years, where you've had problems where a project might be a good project and we want to see it go forward, but the council's hands were tied for making overriding considerations. So we think there's a lot of really great steps being made as part of this. And again, it is refinements where we think there should be some tweaks to the ordinance as it stands now. I've handed out our sample changes that we would make, so it would make it really easy for you to understand how we think it ought to be revised. But as Scott said, we think that it would be valuable to allow for overriding considerations for economic development projects in the downtown. That doesn't mean that the floodgates open and all of a sudden there's a ton of development in the downtown. It just means that if there's a project that we can't foresee right now that is really a good project for the community, that the council has the opportunity to consider it and approve it. And that's just like any other jurisdiction. There are any other jurisdictions that I work with that actually tie their own hands up front in an ordinance saying we can't make overriding considerations for projects. All other jurisdictions basically say, we'll consider each project as it comes along. We'll look at the environmental analysis. If there are significant unavoidable impacts, we'll decide whether or not there's enough community benefit from that project to approve it. And that's what we're asking you to do today with the downtown area. And then the other change we thought would be important would be to allow for the transfer of development rights within the downtown area beyond 1,000 square feet. So let's say you're on one, maybe you're 5 or 6 blocks away from a developing project and you've got square footage to move, that you can move that square footage over there. You've torn it down, and now another applicant wants to build it. You're just basically taking that square footage and you're shifting it over to a different part of the downtown. We think that that should be more than 1,000 square feet, that you should be able to do that. And if there are significant unavoidable impacts, that you could override it if there's enough community benefit. So that's what we're suggesting for the downtown. On Upper State Street, which is page 2, we're suggesting, as Mr. Dayton outlined, we'd like to be able to see people apply for small additions. And this isn't saying that they can apply for a small addition and still have a project-specific impact. We're just saying, let them apply. And if they don't have a project-specific impact, let them have 2,000 square feet, not just 1,000 square feet. There are a number of properties up there. I mean, Sumida Gardens is one of them. La Sumida, the former nursery, that's a property that could accommodate more square footage. And if it doesn't have a project-specific impact, why say no? That's our question. And then with respect to economic development in the outlying areas, why would you say no to a project that has economic development, it's an economic development project, if there's no impacts? So it's just, we were kind of confused by that. We didn't understand why that would be excluded. And then lastly, we have the same change for transfer of development rights. We want to be able to allow for the transfer of those rights. And if there are impacts that can't be mitigated, just allow the council to consider that. Because there are projects that will come into being that we haven't anticipated. And right now what they're saying is that we're looking at La Cumbra and 5 Points, and rather than saying we can do economic development projects in that area, we're saying we'll do a specific plan. Well, I think that's fine for that particular site, but not necessarily other sites. And then the last item, which is what Mr. Schell brought up, was just the question about how traffic gets moved around when you're transferring development credits. And then our understanding was that you could transfer development square footage from one site to another and be able to take that traffic with you in your development area. So if you're in your downtown area, you could tear down 5,000 square feet on one site and build it on another site, and the traffic that was associated with that 5,000 square feet would travel over to the other site, because basically you're just sort of moving parts around in a development area, say the downtown, or maybe it's Upper State Street, or maybe it's the Mesa or Coast Village Road. And we just like to figure out whether or not that we understood them correctly and that we ought to change the code to allow for that if that's what they meant.
Great. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
And Trish Allen is our last public speaker.
I think I'll donate my time to my colleagues that already spoke. I'm here to continue to show my support for what Scott and Lisa just explained to the Ordinance Committee. When I'm looking at the staff report, today's staff report, and reading through the summary of what staff considered for the Horowitz group and the outlying areas, I think that that's a really good example of what we're talking about. Here's a project or a project site, specific site, where staff heard the owner of the property, wanting some flexibility for those specific lots for auto sales, and staff did amend the proposed ordinance to include that as an economic development category. So along those, I'm just using that as an example. Along those same lines, I think we're asking for that flexibility. Let the project merits stand alone. Let the developer decide if they want to go through that analysis in terms of a potential traffic impact for that use. Maybe there is some benefit to it. So that, I think that encapsulates our request for more flexibility in the outlying areas. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and close the public comment. Just want to say that with mindful of the time, we've got a city council meeting in about 15 minutes, and some of these questions are going to want a little, discussion. I believe that it would be, I just want to put it to the committee that we would want to possibly continue this so we can keep this conversation going. And I don't know how much we want to get into right now and open up a whole bunch of these discussions, but maybe there's some specific responses we could hear right now. But I would, how would staff feel about us scheduling another time for us to come back to ordinance and be able to take this and really keep this conversation going? Would that be good? All right.
Yeah, I completely concur with that. That's a wise move. And I think maybe now is a good cutoff point.
All right. Everybody all right with that? And then we'll just, unless Ms. Weiss, is there something specific that you'd want to, or your team would want to comment on right now? But I really think we should begin to look forward to what we would be discussing at the next meeting. And maybe, we've got a lot of good background here. We have some particular suggestions from the public and a few questions that still haven't been answered from us. Is there anything else that you see that we should have on the next agenda?
Well, Mr. Chair, what I would suggest is that we focus on this issue of the differences between the two strategies and why either makes sense or not.
Yeah, I'm not even sure they're different strategies. They're just different implementations of the same strategy.
Probably different, described as different levels.
Right. And if you could address specifically what was put forward
Absolutely.
today, that would be great, if you don't mind me adding that.
That's just great. Okay, so let's, do we have a date that we want to say right now from staff as to when we could come back and keep this conversation going?
Yes, we would like a motion to continue to January 29th meeting. Is that?
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
Okay, great. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Okay, very good. So that passes. Thank you all very much for coming. Thanks, everyone, for your participation. We're adjourned.